Hello and welcome to Telesur. I'm Ian Bruce and this is Interviews from Quito, the programme where we explore some of the big challenges facing this country and the region. In today's programme, the indigenous-led uprising in Ecuador. It's being called a massive victory against the government and the IMF. But how did such a huge explosion of opposition come about? What were the forces that drove the protests? How has the Ecuadorian establishment reacted? And what comes next? To discuss this, we have with us University Professor Ricardo Restrepo. But first, let's take a look at this short video.
Ecuador has struck down Decree 883. The government published an executive decree signed by President Lenin Moreno indicating that the law would cease to be effective at midnight local time, 2nd of October 15th. The decree sparked massive popular protests across Ecuador against the austerity measures it entailed, including a dramatic rise in fuel prices by up to 123%. The country's indigenous movement had demanded that the government carry out immediately its commitment to repeal the decree as agreed in talks on Sunday evening.
Thank you, Ricardo. Let's start with the main question. Everyone says this was a huge victory against the IMF. How much of a victory do you think it really was?
Well, I think it was a very big victory for the people of Ecuador, and particularly for the indigenous movement. The indigenous movement has a long history of resisting neoliberal, neo-colonial policies throughout the 1990s, since the uprising in 1990, the confirmation of CONAIE, 1992, 94, 96, 2000, and really 2000 was a big culmination in that when they effectively forced the leaving of President Jamil Mawad after all the neoliberal policies that had been imposed throughout this time that basically took the country down a cliff, huge economic, political and social crisis, and things had kind of, after some turmoil up into 2006, they'd been winding down, and then there was relative stability between 2006 2016. And this is really a new voice. The indigenous movement managed to really condense and be the microphone in the most visible face of anti-austerity, anti-neoliberal policies that really are Robin Hood in reverse. And they had the support of the people, and they effectively brought down a decree that was very much anti-popular. So I think that I think the Ecuadorian society has a big debt right now with the indigenous movement, because they really did do the organization that was required to roll back a very nefarious economic policy. Not the whole package, but at least one big fang in that package, which was the elevation of fuel prices by bringing down the subsidies, and particularly diesel, which affects the whole economy, for one thing, and then those that are most affected are people who are poorest, also because of transportation costs, they go up, as well as food prices go up. So general inflation goes up, and the most affected by that are poor people. So,
But do you think this central plank of the austerity package, the fuel subsidies, the removal of fuel subsidies, do you think that is now officially dead?
Well, for the moment, I mean, nothing is, kind of set in stone forever. So it's fluctuating. Part of the new decree, which rolled back Decree 883, which basically took down the subsidies that were a benefit to the neediest in the population, says that we have to create a new decree. So that has to be looked at as well. We have to look at what that decree will look like. And even if a new decree comes about that doesn't have nefarious policies, it might be that the next one will. So, nothing is dead and set in stone in politics.
The chief economist of the IMF just said in Washington, we still want to get these reforms through. We want to get them done. So what do you think the government and its IMF advisors will try to do to achieve that?
Well, they hold that position. But I think that it's a very weak government now because if you remember, and you were here in Quito, so the official position when the policies were first enacted was that we're not taking this down, the government is firm, these are the right policies for the country, so there's no force that can roll them back. Then the transport sector rose up, and the transport sector decided, well, really what we want is to bring our prices up. And so they made a deal with the government, and they kind of were, they went out of the picture. But
although not all their members, in many regions, the buses remained stopped, trucks weren't running, taxis weren't running.
Absolutely, because there was a lot of sympathy, general sympathy, not only from the transport sector, but general citizens' sympathy of a movement against these anti-popular policies. So, and of course the people who operate the transport sector are part of that, and they're affected personally, and their loved ones are affected as well. So people, it was really quite astonishing to see the whole country was brought to a standstill. All, major roads were blocked, people couldn't get from place A to place B, and people were generally in support for this. But the real organization that came and had a direct face, was the indigenous movement.
I want to dig into that in just a moment, but just talking about the measures and so forth, and the government. You also said the government is now very weak. What do you think this means for ruling class politics in Ecuador? Do you think the traditional right, the business class, will ditch Lenin Moreno?
I think that they've never had much sympathy for Moreno in the first place. They denounced that he had committed fraud when he won at the beginning of his term in 2017. But of course they started to love him, at least strategically love him, because he enacted the policies that they wanted. That the right wanted, and in fact the indigenous movement and their leaders, Jaime Vargas, said it to his face in the last dialogues on Sunday, when he said that it seems like the right and entrepreneurial business groups are governing, and you're just a facade. And yes, they're only with him, until it's not convenient anymore. And that's why also it's quite telling that Moreno went to Guayaquil and transferred the government to Guayaquil as, this is the real throne. I have to go back to the real powers behind the throne. And they'll ditch him if they don't see him convenient. But I think that these right-wing groups are also very debilitated at the moment, because in this process, a lot of masks have come down. So if you look at Nebot, who would have been the person to really capitalize on Moreno's going down, he said certain things that really polarized the population against him, particularly speaking against those people who were the face and giving voice to popular sentiment to bring down these neoliberal policies. And he basically told the indigenous movement, and it was rightly perceived as something very racist, to go back to the highlands, right? And even not recognizing the diversity and even the geographic diversity of the indigenous populations around the country, not giving recognition to indigenous peoples in the Amazon. So he would have, he basically shot himself in the foot for the next elections, because that clip is going to be played forever and will be brought to his face. So I think that he really brought down his probability of being successful as well as Lasso. So Lasso is deeply undermined, because he, very vociferously advocated for these policies, which, interestingly enough, he criticized, that the previous government, and said that this was another result of the previous Correa administration, because of its irresponsible populist policies, bringing up the external public debt so much. But when he was, the finance minister, public debt was 3 times what it was when Correa left office. So
we'll get on to in a moment to what this means for the Correa-led opposition.
Yeah.
But let's go back to the protests themselves again now. I mean, I don't think anybody expected an explosion of resistance on this scale.
No,
from any.
I think even the indigenous movement.
They said it themselves. We didn't expect so many people to come to Quito.
And this is why they were tentative in the first steps. Like, yes, we're calling on a march, and we are not happy with this. But they hadn't been mobilized, because even though they had these big mobilizations like the ones we talked about in 2000 and previous to that 1990, these were the 2 big pinnacles before.
But for the last 10 years or so, everyone said the indigenous movement's finished, it's weakened, it's divided, it's politically confused, all this kind of things.
And there was discontent within the indigenous movement with various, it was mixed. You never had a national uprising, as we just witnessed. So they were very tentative.
So how did because obviously there were many sectors involved, but I think it's clear that the indigenous movement was the vanguard of this.
Absolutely.
So how did it do that? After these years of being so much weakened, how did it suddenly recover and lead this thing?
Well, I think that the indigenous movement has deep roots in social organization. So it doesn't just go back even a decade or 2. So there's, deep bonds. And it really did, there was it was a match on gasoline. People are generally not excited about the Moreno administration. It's one of the most unpopular administrations in the region and the world. After it began in relatively high numbers, so it had about 70% when Moreno, started his administration. But I think that now, in this, combustible, people are unsatisfied, poverty's gone up, unemployment has gone up, people are more, they feel betrayed, and also they see that, that things have changed for the worse when they were promised to keep on getting better. With a change of style, people wanted, I think that's where the dialogue really came about. The dialogue discourse really, gained force under the Moreno administration.
I mean, I want to get a bit of a clear idea of what the other forces were in this movement and how they kind of fitted together. Because, while the indigenous were at the forefront, there were women, there were the youth played a very major role here in Quito. Students, students and other youth.
And teachers.
I didn't see a lot of organized trade unionists, but I'm sure they were there.
Yeah, they were there.
How did those different components fit together? What was the dynamic?
Well, I think that it was very spontaneous. I don't think there was a grandmaster plan that was effective. There were, people were subject to very similar circumstances from different angles. So the food, the coot, the CONAIE is obviously made up of tons of organizations which are porous, and part of it's one of the characteristics of the indigenous movement is that people participate in various organizations at the same time, and then CONAIE kind of
a sort of umbrella.
Is the umbrella for it all, but there's quite a bit of diversity in there as well.
And differences, political differences.
Political differences, because they were very much, for instance, against the Correa administration, whereas the FEI and FENOCIN were for the Correa administration. So tons of complexity, but I think that people, they shared. There was a gut and also a perception of reality that was shared, that this was a government of the right that was aligned with the Trump administration, and that it went against their vital interests and rights. And people didn't really know what their force was. I mean, people were just dissatisfied and they wanted to get out. So it was very interesting, like, to see the indigenous movement become the face and the voice and have the microphone, but they were able to operate and do this because everybody, most of the population was with them. And we saw that with the cacerolazos, which, for your viewers...
the pot-banging protest.
Pot-banging, and because there was a curfew that was imposed and people were supposed to stay at home. So, a lot of people defied that in the streets and were out protesting. But then in general, it was really something to see that even people who stayed at home came out with their pots.
On their terraces at their windows.
And everybody was banging, and you could text just anybody around the country and be like, hey, are you hearing this? Is this going on? And people, yeah, is it going there too? And people were, catching on to this was a generalized situation.
I mean, you talked about the spontaneity of this movement. I mean, one thing that seemed to me striking, even leaving aside the indigenous movement with its own characteristics, so take the youth and the urban movement, the workers and so forth, they were all also present. But there was almost no political presence. I mean, I'm not saying the different left currents, insofar as they exist, they were obviously on the streets, but you didn't feel that there was any kind of political leadership or political project. I mean, and that raises questions for the left, I think.
Absolutely. And I think that this has a lot of questions. I mean, your original question was it really a victory? And we'll see, because the indigenous movement doesn't have a big part of the vote. So they're talking about creating a new party that can kind of come together and create a political agenda that
so
they
already created Pachakutik, 15 years ago or more, and 3%. It didn't really work.
Exactly. So this is a new opportunity, I think. And, the indigenous movement has been very suspicious of, is this really a victory? This happened with Jamil Mawad as well, when they took out that president. But things didn't, they didn't become government. They weren't able to implement, their policies. They then were aligned with Lucio Gutierrez, and but they didn't get what they wanted either out of that back in 2005. So, it's not exactly all said and done. So they have to think strategically because they've been betrayed before, and they haven't always had a view. I think this is one of the main challenges of the indigenous movement is thinking about how to be the state, how to be the government, because they have had successes. For instance, like the plurinational intercultural character of the state, which is formalized
in the
2008 Constitution. That is all coming out of the indigenous movement, which put that there, and that was incorporated as a national agenda that had to be recognized, and public policy had to revolve around that. Still with tons of gaps, but at least the objective is there, and they have to now think about, well, we don't just criticize. Now it's time to build, and I think that's where the hugest challenge for them lies. Is thinking about how they
just part that a moment, because how does that sit alongside the situation now for what has been, for many years now, the principal component of the left in Ecuador, which is of course the movement around Rafael Correa, currently expressed by the Citizens' Revolution movement. Because they, the government is obviously has right the way through the protests and, blamed Correa and Venezuela, of course, for organising it, which the indigenous leaders themselves said was ridiculous. We've been fighting Correa for the last 10 years. What makes you think he's suddenly organising us? But leaving that aside, I mean, obviously the Correa movement has a real force, has an electoral force, has force in many social organisations, and they were obviously on the streets. But there was no sense that the Correa or the leadership of the Citizens' Revolution movement was really playing a central role in this movement.
No.
And now, of course, they're being demonized, they're being locked up and persecuted. So where do you think that leaves the citizens' revolution movement, that sort of political part of the left?
Well, I think that is a political force that is there for the taking, so to speak. And if the indigenous movement thinks strategically, it can potentially create an alliance that can be successful.
Which will obviously have to overcome some bad feelings from the past.
Huge. So it's not also, you can work in a process of elimination. Like we went through the right-wing, actors and parties a second ago. Like, the indigenous movement, perhaps, hopefully, it will have enough vision not to align itself with the neoliberal right once again, which it did back in 2016 and 17. And think, well, which are our most natural allies here? Who has a left anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, anti-neoliberal agenda? Who can implement policies of big change? Sure, the citizens' revolution, can't win by itself either. It's got about a 30% backing. And the indigenous movement can go up from its current numbers after this, I think, quite a bit. And the right has been hugely weakened after this. So, but I think that the big driving force in this, and they have to recognize, for the good of the country and for them as a political subject and as a human subject, is the responsibility that, wow, we can take power through democratic processes, but we have to create adequate alliances. And that's where there's opportunities.
And they have to create their own political project.
Absolutely.
In alliance with others.
And I think that I would hope, I think that a lot of people have kind of, like macroscopic hopes about, well, I hope it all works out well. But I would hope that I think that the right way to bring that kind of scenario about is to think programmatically. So what are common interests that we have in terms of, the ideas that can bring us together, because more ideas bring us together than apart, that we can come together to share a government and propose something that is beneficial for most of the country, and that is, good for the country as a whole. And I think that there's tons of challenges, for that to come about, because there's a lot of resentments that have built up over the last years on both sides. I think mostly the indigenous peoples always as well have, some legitimate concerns. And
just before we run out of time, Ricardo, because I just want to ask one final question to open it out. Do you think this is a turning point for the balance between left and right, not just in Ecuador, but in Latin America?
I think for Ecuador, it is a turning point. If the left plays it well and can capitalize it, and it's not just a race to the bottom, because we can also just have that, which we have done in the past, from 1981 to 2006, it was a race to the bottom. And yeah, the political map of the Latin America is changing, and I think that it is a short cycle that the right has had up until now, and there's clear signs of it coming to an end.
That's a very good point to end on. Thank you very much, Ricardo. We've been talking to Ricardo Restrepo about the extraordinary victory of the indigenous-led uprising against IMF policies here in Ecuador. Thank you for watching Interviews from Quito. I'm Ian Bruce. Until next time.